Thank you for being here, all of you. I'm very happy to be once again in this Prague conference on populism, which by the years has become one of the most important in Europe on this subject. As this is not my first time to participate in this event, I recall some extraordinary thinkers who in previous years shared important ideas about populism in this room. I'm not going to say by name who they were, but I remember some excellent ideas that have been presented here. I'm humbled. For my more modest part, what I'm going to try to do today is to say something that is definitely original, since I've never presented it before, and which I hope will also appeal to your own interests on the subject of populism. So, the title of my presentation today is Populism as Democratic Illiberalism, and my more particular focus will be on how this populism fits a general political systems theory, which we do not have out there. Ultimately, I'm going to present a typology of the universe of political systems in which populism will take its own specific position and place. Let us then begin from the source of all contention, which is the concept of populism. Granted, first of all, the fact that when we say populism, quote unquote, we understand a large number of things, or better elements, including, as you noticed in the previous panel, ideas, ideologies, programmatic appeals, social attitudes, psychological or mental predispositions, political strategies, specific verbal discourses, symbolic representations, personal styles, even sartorial ones, the way, the way people dress up, populist leaders dress up in some ways, some people tell us, and much, much more, all of which things or elements we associate with some generic notion of populism. Granted also the fact that by saying populism, we refer to a various number of subjects, or, if you will, in more proper political science terminology, units of analysis, ranging from individual leaders, we say, for example, Perón is a populist, to political parties or movements, as in the phrase, Perón's party is a populist party, to entire political systems, as in the phrase, Peronism is a classic example of populism, to individual countries. We say, for example, Argentina under Perón was a populist country. So we have many elements, many things, many subjects. Now, populism, quote unquote again, may well signify all those things already mentioned and much more, and point to all subjects mentioned and much more. But above everything else, and this is the point I want to drive home today, above everything else, at the highest level of analysis, at the highest level of generality, modern-day populism constitutes a novel political system with specific socio-political and geographical and cultural coordinates, and which system combines two, and only two, core characteristic elements. It is a system, populism, it is a system, this is my contention, that is at once democratic and illiberal. Populism, therefore, is minimally defined and sufficiently well understood, if we try to apply it out there, as a system of democratic illiberalism. As such, and as I will try to show in the remaining of my time, populism can be placed in a full-blown typology of political systems. When I say political systems, I mean governments, ruling systems, right? Let me have that straight. With which systems populism can be compared and contrasted. Which raises two initial questions right away. What exactly do we need a typology of political systems, and why do we need a typology of political systems? And what, after all, is a typology? I will try to answer those two questions briefly, To the first question, the answer is quite simple. In the globalized and fast-changing world of ours, we need to have in mind a logical ordering of political systems worldwide, globally, in order to make sense of politics. Unfortunately, we do not have, so far, good typologies. The best we have is simple classifications. So there is a difference between classification and typology. I will explain briefly. So we have simple classifications of political systems based on one single criterion. Actually, this is the difference. Classifications are based on one single criterion. Typologies are much more complex things. We need more criteria there. So our classifications so far refer to how much democratic or undemocratic the units of analysis that we use and we apply our theories on are. The most well-known of those classifications are those of VDEM. V is for, I don't know, huh? Varieties of democracy, you're right, thanks. And the other one is the classification by the Economist Intelligence Unit. Both are pretty intelligent classifications, but they also have significant problems. I will mention only, and here you see the two classifications. Okay, the first is the VDEM one, which classifies political systems on a spectrum from democracy on the right, full democracy, to non-democracy on the left. Okay, and in between you have two other classes, two categories. Similarly, not quite differently in this sense, the Economist Intelligence Unit classification of regimes, again, utilizes a spectrum from full democracies on the right to authoritarian regimes on the left. Again, here there are two intermediate categories which are not, I find, a bit problematic. I will explain. So there are three major problems that I'm going to mention here. The first is that those are not typologies. As I said, those are simple classifications based on one single criterion, the quality of democracy. They simply, measure the quality of democracy. The second thing here is that democracy, quote unquote again, and the other terms used in them are hardly defined. What is a hybrid regime, you may ask? I have no answer. Is that half democratic? Is that democratic or non-democratic? And which democracies are not electoral, as in the first classification, electoral democracy? By definition, all democracies are electoral. So defining by adjectives, as those classifications do all of the times, is not necessarily a very good idea. And my third contention or objection to those classifications is populism. Where is populism in those classifications? Do you see that? But our purpose is to locate populism among other political systems. I don't see any populism here. Now, on to my second initial question. What is a typology? It is an ordering of things resulting from more than one criterion, as I said already. Typologies are logical systems of dividing things into types based on commonly shared properties. Constructing a typology involves a hierarchical systematization, a vertical hierarchical systematization, which begins from the all-inclusive category at the top. We call it the genus, moves down to more specific level categories. We call them the species, and ends with the lowest categories at its base level. We call that the subspecies. It can go even further down, subspecies, subspecies, etc., etc. To give an example, a typology of the genus animals includes two broad species, the vertebrates and the invertebrates, right? We all know that. Each species is then divided into subspecies, thus invertebrates includes such subspecies of animals as snails, spiders, crabs, sponges. And the species vertebrates comprises of birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. So we have a typology already. We can move further down. Each species is divided into subspecies, and so on and so forth. For instance, mammals, commonly defined as animals that make milk for their young and grow hair, are distinguished into carnivorous and herbivorous. And then we can distinguish those subspecies into more and more and more, and so on and so forth with animals. But also, like animals, like political systems. So now, moving from the animal world to the universe of political systems, the question becomes, how can we devise a typology? And this is a big question. How can we devise a typology which includes all major political systems? This requires two things. Firstly, it requires that we think in terms of a hierarchy that proceeds from the overall genus at the top to different types of species and subspecies, and showing their location within the genus. It's a kind of complicated process. And the second thing it requires is a proper vocabulary of the terms that are necessary for such an exercise. So we need terms, we need clear terms. But here's the good news. As I'm going to show, in order to begin producing a typology of political systems, also comprising populism, we only need two terms. Two terms are enough, and they're opposites. And those terms can be used either by themselves or in the various combinations they produce between them. Those terms are democracy, and non-democracy, of course, as the opposite, and liberalism and illiberalism. Now, the terms. Here are very concise terms of those concise definitions, if you like, of those four terms. And those are very clear, I hope. So I define a democracy as a political system in which political parties compete in elections for power. Those elections are fairly, fair and free. And when a party loses the elections, it is required to leave office immediately, without a fuss, and of course, peacefully. Non-democracy is exactly the opposite. Here we have political systems that they do not usually allow elections. Even if they allow elections, though, those elections are typically rigged, and the opposition can never win in those elections. So the results are preordained. Liberalism, thirdly, is a set of ideas or a doctrine that grapples with social divisions in society. It insists on individual liberty, rule of law. It promotes political moderation rather than polarization, and protects the rights of lawful or legal minorities. Illiberalism, by contrast, is a set of ideas or a doctrine or practice that disregards established institutions, liberal institutions, I mean. It goes against the rule of law. It permits polarization. Actually, it thrives on polarization and sponsors the idea of an oversoul or majoritarian people, the perennial, the ordinary people in populism. Now, with this basic vocabulary in mind, we are ready to produce a typology proceeding from top to down in a way that differentiates the overall genus of political systems into more and more specific types and subtypes, which, while exclusive to each other, they collectively comprise the original genus. This is the typical Aristotelian method of per genus et differentiam. Moving this way, we come up with the following typology, which I'm going to present as it builds in a series of sequential steps, and I hope you will enjoy the process. So I will show you how we build a typology as well. So first we begin with the overall genus, all types of political systems. Imagine any type of political system in time and space, okay? But we're focusing on modern political systems mostly. Then we go one level down and distinguish between the two broad species of political systems, democracies and non-democracies. So now we have the genus and we have the species at the first level. Democracies, as I already said, feature adequately free and fair elections. Once defeated, incumbents leave office peacefully. Non-democracies, by contrast, are those systems that oppose parliamentary democracy, even if they allow elections, and incumbents there are expected to hold power by force and/or intimidation. Now, if we turn to the non-democratic lump on the right, we get at least 5 subspecies. And I'll go very fast over them. The first subspecies is elected autocracies. Those are all but outright dictatorships characterized by elected strongmen running corrupt states and suppressing the opposition. Think of Russia. I would think of Belarus as well. Turkey, I think, fits this case very well. Then we have another subspecies. We have authoritarian systems. Those are classic dictatorships run by military supremos who grab power by coup and establish disciplined, ideological, and most often interventionist states. We had such an example last year in Myanmar. We had another case in Mali, in Africa. We have a number of historical cases, like Spain under Franco, Mussolini's Italy fits here, Greece under the military dictatorship, etc. A third subtype here is totalitarianism. Totalitarian systems are single-party states ruled by non-elected strongmen, exercising total control over their citizens' lives. Privacy and free expression are almost entirely impossible here. Typical case is China, right? So those cases are distinguished pretty well, as you can see so far. Then we have sultanism. I mean, those are monocracies, sultanistic. The term comes from Max Weber, the great Weber. They are also states of a totalitarian nature. They feature a cult for the personality of the leader who rules the state by the aid of trusted family members and courtiers. Examples here are North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Romania under Ceausescu, if you wish, Libya under Gaddafi. We have many examples like that, Libya under Gaddafi, etc. And then a third subspecies here is theocracies. Okay, they are run by religious zealots who rule in the name of some god. They reject secular, individual, and social freedoms and do not recognize human rights, usually. Examples here are Iran, under the Ayatollahs, Afghanistan. You have many, all right? So far, so good with the non-democracy species, right? So now let's turn to the democracy species, which is much more interesting, I think, and appeals more to my own interests. So now let's see how, what is underneath the species democracy. Here we find 2 major subspecies, liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. You remember, we only need 4 terms. And I could stop here, actually, but I will go further down because it's much more important. So liberal democracies are both democratic. They have 2 characteristics, 2 core characteristics. They're both democratic and abiding by the rule of law, while also protecting the rights of lawful minorities. Czech Republic, for example, is a case of that. Most EU member states belong here, and other liberal democracies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, many states in Latin America, South Korea, Taiwan, and that's about it, I think, Israel. That's about it. We don't have that many. And then we have illiberal democracies. Those are democracies those are democratic systems, but systems that reject the principles of political liberalism. But here, there is a snag. We have a difficulty here. For not all illiberal democracies are the same, and therefore readily comparable. Illiberal democracies, in fact, are distinguished into 2 types, 2 subspecies. The first type includes illiberal democracies. How am I doing with time? I'm not keeping time here, but I will finish soon. So the first type of illiberal democracies includes political systems that have never in the past experienced political liberalism. So those are pre-liberal illiberal democracies. So illiberal states that have not experienced do not have an experience, a historical experience of liberalism in the past. The second type includes formerly liberal democracies, that is, systems with a certain experience of liberalism, which have subsequently rejected their political liberalism in favor of illiberalism. Okay? And I call them modern populism, modern populist states. Now, this is one hell of a difference between the two types of illiberal democratic systems. And let me explain. Beginning with pre-liberal, illiberal democracies, those systems are the ones that you can find in the pages of a famous article titled The Rise of Illiberal Democracy, authored by Farid Zakaria and published in Foreign Affairs in 1997. That is 25 years ago. The article focuses explicitly on such country cases as, to mention a few, Sierra Leone and Ethiopia from Africa, Pakistan, Iran, and the Palestinian Authority from Asia, Haiti and Peru from Central and Latin America, and indeed post-Soviet Russia. Those are the cases in that article. Remember, we're in the peak of the fourth wave of democratization by that time, when Farid Zakaria writes. Now, what Zakaria recognized as common in all of those cases, the cases that I mentioned and other cases that he mentions in his article, was that despite their customary illiberalism, those states had acquired at the time of his writing some facade of electoral democratic politics. After all, Yeltsin was elected as president in Russia, and so was Yasser Arafat in the Palestinian general elections of 1996. By the way, he received 90% of the vote, but that's another story. Now, if you look at the countries examined by Zakaria 25 years ago, let us call it Zakaria land. I like this term, and I use that in my mind. You discover a vast geographical territory covered with states afflicted with civil strife, even today, or until today, or more specifically today, systemic corruption, economic underdevelopment, and democratic breakdowns. The occasional use of the ballot box cannot obscure the fact that those states remain socially traditional or traditionalist, politically oligarchic, most often theocratic, and although some of them still retain the trappings of democracy, they operate as de facto autocracies. A good example is Zakaria's own native land, India. It belongs here. Now, I'm going to the other lamp there, modern populism. So, pre-liberal, illiberal democracies must be distinguished, as I said, from post-liberal, liberal democracies. Here we are in the domain of modern populism, seen as democratic illiberalism. Modern-day populism, therefore, points to political parties and their leaders who arise in established liberal and secular democracies by attacking liberal institutions and the rule of law. And when they win elections and become a system, populist parties lead their countries to illiberalism without abandoning democracy. This is what has happened in places like Argentina, which I mentioned earlier as an example, in neighboring Hungary, for which I have a very soft spot, my own little country, Greece, or the United States under Trump. Beware, it's an election year in the States. In closing, and as populism is not likely to altogether disappear in any of those countries or in many other countries, you should stay tuned until the next episodes of Populist as Illiberal Democracy appears and is getting strong. At least now you have a concise but complete typology of well-defined political systems, including populism, to guide your thinking. And if you want to read more about populism and democracy and liberal democracy, perhaps you may want to, or please do visit my site. You will find lots of materials in there, including visuals, videos. You will even find a comic, which I'm sure you will enjoy. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks for listening to me.
Okay, so I will now just pass the floor to you. So if you have, please, do you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll just give you a mic to ask the question. Yeah, okay. We don't have, okay.
Stephen.
Yeah.
Hello, thanks for interesting speech. I was wondering about one thing. Now that I got a new position in Sweden, I know that the leftist party there often is considered populist, but they've always, not always, but in modern times, respected human rights and rule of law. So I'm wondering, is it possible to be a populist and also liberal? Like, or do you think it's wrong to classify the leftist party as populist? The other thing is not really important, but a little comment is, I would not consider China today to be totalitarian. I would consider under Mao, but there is some amount of pluralism, and there are a lot of NGOs, and sometimes they actually influence policy. I don't know if that's so important for you. Maybe a third small question is, Russia often, like in the comparative politics textbooks, you know, like about 15 years ago, was considered the ideal type illiberal democracy. But I think according to what you said, it was never an illiberal democracy.
Which one? Which country?
Russia. Russia under Putin. You know, like I remember having to teach a textbook around 2014, and Putin was given as the example of illiberal democracy. But I would think by then it was not democratic at all. But I was wondering, like, if you had considered it, according to what you said, it would only be a, what was it, did you call it a pre-something? I forgot the name. Yeah, pre-modern, it would have been a pre-modern democracy. So I'm just wondering, like, if you think they were always wrong to call Russia a illiberal democracy. Thank you.
Okay, we can collect a second question. Andrei, please.
Thank you very much. I also would support this argument that there can be a liberal and democracy and populism together. I am from Slovakia, and we have a populist in power, two parties out of four. They're slightly different, but basically they're fighting for rule of law, for justice, because previous government was more or less in the status of captured state, you know. It was kind of mafia government, you know. So yeah, they're respecting basically liberal rights. There is democracy, but we have still got strong populists there, you know, in the parliament and the government. Thank you.
Okay, if you can respond.
Yeah, you see, that's funny. It always comes to particular cases and how we define those cases. And we do that because we do not have clear terms. So what I've tried to do here is, you notice that I began with my terms. So when I say democracy, I know what I mean by that, or what I say non-democracy, etc., etc. Now, cases are not clear. First thing, are not absolutely clear. We need empirical research in all cases because this is a very comparative, very general typology, okay? And I do not know what is happening in Slovakia, to come to your question. So it's up to you, I mean, to do the empirical research and perhaps falsify this typology or verify that. This is how it works. I'm not supposed to know Slovakia very well. I know a number of cases better than others, of course. The second thing here is that countries' political systems change. We have to take that into account. That is very important. When you think about political systems, you have to think about changes. So Russia under Yeltsin was entirely different than Russia under Putin in the early years of Putinism, and now the same happens for the case of Turkey, for example. Okay, so Erdogan was a different leader in 2003 when he came into power, and then he evolved, he changed. And Erdoganism today is entirely different than it used to be. So we have to take those changes into account. So this answers the question, I think, about Russia. China, whether China is a totalitarian state, again, it depends on the definition. If you don't call that a totalitarian state, how do you call that? And an authoritarian state? I don't know. We have to find something. I think that as long as you don't have elections and as long as you have this enormous surveillance system that, that surveys every nook and cranny in the lives of Chinese, I classify that, I term that and I classify that as totalitarian. If you have a better term, I'm very much willing to hear it. About the Social Democrats in Sweden, I classify them as liberal. Although, sorry? Oh, the leftist party, you said. Oh, the leftist party, sorry. Well, I don't know much about it, so I cannot.
Because they're often called the populist party, but they
Listen, many things are called the populist this or that, as I said in the beginning of my talk, and that's fine with me. But here I'm talking about systems. I'm not talking even about parties. So I'm talking about systems means that a political party has come into power, and that party stays in power and exercises power in a number of ways: liberal, populist, totalitarian, authoritarian, blah, 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 you name it, right? So I'm not talking about political parties right now. I mean, you can call your political parties whatever you want, but here I am at the system level of analysis.
Okay, Daniele?
Thanks for that really illuminating presentation, Takis. A quick question about your definition of democracy. I can see the power and the importance of sticking to a kind of minimal definition, but I wonder whether it is not necessary to add one word to your definition. So, free, fair, and regular elections, which come about regularly, well, as the term suggests. I'm saying that because, of course, for instance, in Great Britain, until recently, when new legislation was introduced, it was for the government to call elections. So the, let's say, tradition was to call them at least every 5 years, but then, of course, they would call them every 4 or every 3.5 if that fitted their agenda. We can conceive of a system in which the elections are free and fair, but they don't come around regularly, and also of a system in which they come around, but that when either political parties or movements or whoever represents citizens in that system do not know when they come around, and therefore cannot get ready, cannot prepare proposals. And in that case, I would argue you would have a very defective kind of democracy.
Yeah, I will answer that right away. Thanks, Daniela. That's of course, that's true. And under free elections and fair elections, the element of regularity is there always. I mean, liberal democracies are always regular. Irregularity you have in non-liberal, non-democratic. For example, Palestine, which I mentioned earlier, the first election was 1996. The next election was 2005. And since then, there is not any other election. So this is not this is a non-democratic system.
Sorry, you defined it as part of your... it's up there. So
yes.
It's democracy. So illiberal democracy in your figure is still a democracy, right? So we can't say, okay, in a liberal democracy, then elections are not regular, because if it is a democracy, what I'm saying is in my view, to be a democracy, it needs to be regular.
I accept your criterion. Yeah, that's fine.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate this classification, typology. It's a difficult task. I wonder how exactly we can distinguish between modern populisms and elected autocracies. It seems to me that if you have a truly illiberal, pluralist party in power, logically, I would not expect them to be removed from power via elections. They would refuse those elections. I think elected autocracies could lose elections. If not national elections, you might claim they regularly lose local elections. In Turkey, in Hungary, they have lost local elections. And I think we are taking it a bit too much as a given that Erdogan is not going to lose elections and removed from power, as well as Putin. But wait long enough, Putin as well as Erdogan, and similar other authoritarian regimes have proven to have lost elections. So this passage from elected autocracy to modern populism is intriguing to me. I wonder what you would think about this.
Okay, and
Can I answer? Very, very quickly, thank you very much for the this comment. This is a very legit comment. So modern populism, think about Orban. Elected autocracy, think about Erdogan, as you mentioned him, or Putin. So as I said earlier, systems change, right? So if Erdogan loses the election and leaves power peacefully, then we're going to classify Turkey as a different country, as a different system as we do today. So that is the litmus test. The litmus test is elections and what happens there. Think about Trump. If his thing against the Capitol Hill had succeeded, perhaps, and he had stayed in power because the electoral college, blah, 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 then we would have a case of electoral autocracy today in the United States. It's not a far-fetched thing to think about it, right? So today we would not classify the United States as a liberal democracy as we do right now, but as an elected autocracy. So system change. But we have the positions here. We have the niches in which to place our cases as history moves on.
Okay, another question, yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks for that. My question actually builds specifically on your comments here. I guess I'm trying to make sense of what a political system ultimately means in this classification, right? If, say, over the course of Putin's regime, his political system changed, right? If, to use your US example, the January 6th uprising had succeeded, that would clearly change the kind of political system the US had after January 6th. But if I'm understanding you correctly, it would also offer a different post hoc interpretation of what the system was before January 6th, or before the election, right? And that seems to me to suggest that the political system can only be known sort of post hoc, right? We can only know after some subsequent attempt at an election or the lack thereof what the system was before that time. So I guess I'm just interested in hearing more about what it means to be a political system, how we define that in the moment as opposed to just as a historian.
Yeah, very, very briefly. A system is, as I said earlier, a government being in power for a number of years and exercising rule. What type of rule? I mean, do they change the constitution? To which direction, for example? So the constitutional law is what defines a political system. For example, Hungary, I always refer to examples, as you will notice, because this is what we are supposed to be doing. In Hungary, Orban has changed the political system, okay, since 2010 towards an illiberal democratic direction, right? A populist direction. So it is not ex post facto that we know. We know that already. We have been knowing that since 2010. I mean, I wrote an article about Hungary. I compared that with Greece in 2012, 2 years into Orban's being in office. So we know that as it happens. We knew that Trump was a populist leader, and the system that he was establishing, okay, or promoting in the United States was quite different than the previous system of Obama. So, two different political systems. You have a liberal system, in Obama's case, and then you have a leader. Agency is very important here as well. So I didn't say anything about that, but that's very, very important. And you have a leader who changes the system throughout. 3 judges in the Supreme Court. I mean, and we watch that. I mean, it is in front of our eyes. It is happening in real historical time, all the times.
Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I would like to ask you about your view about the interplay about illiberal democracy and democratic illiberalism first. And second, I would like to ask you about what Yasha Mounk mentioned in his book, that it's kind of an oxymoron to have illiberalism and democracy, that when you have media and institutions captured, you cannot have fair and free elections.
Should I answer that? Yeah, I know this this debate. Yasa is excited with the word oxymoron here, I think. Another beautiful Greek word, by the way. No, it is not an oxymoron, because you have seen that in practice. I mean, take Hungary again. I mean, the system is fully liberal. I mean, he has changed the constitution. He has changed all the liberal institutions, the courts, the education. He kicked out the university, the everything. But the country remains democratic. We want it, we like it or not. By the way, and also to link it to what Daniela said earlier, I didn't have the opportunity to go into more detail, of course, because there is lots of detail here. The elections in Hungary, the last election 2 months ago, was free but was not fair. So I would qualify about my criterion of this is why I said adequately fair. But you have the election in Hungary, in my opinion, was free, absolutely free, but unfair. I mean, very, 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 very unfair. So in that sense, but it was still an election. I mean, the Hungarian people could vote against Orbán. I mean, no one told them not to vote against Orbán. I mean, they were given incentives to vote in favor of Orbán. This we know, right? But we cannot say that the election was not free. We cannot say that Hungary is a not democratic country, because in that case, we will have to say what Hungary is. Is that an authoritarian state? Is that a totalitarian state? Is that a non-democratic state? What is that? So I hold by my position. I consider, cases like Hungary, Poland, perhaps other cases as well. We can talk about, we could talk about Latin American cases as well. I know something about, as those countries are democratic, but they are illiberal. So there is not any oxymoron here. It is, we see that in real practice, I think. But anybody can dispute that, of course. Thanks.
Okay, so we have time for 2 last brief questions. So please, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe you can expand a bit more on that, because I have an impression, so if those elections are not fair, then we're moving to the right side of what we see here on the board, non-democracy. So in that sense, I still struggle to see how you would put it in modern populism or pre-liberal democracy if the elections are not fair. That's the first point. Second of all, I kind of miss in your whole categorization the way some of our democracies in the West work, where you don't need 50% of votes to get in power. You have very entrenched systems where, for example, in France or in the UK electoral system, where you don't actually have elections where 50% of electors are represented in the government or the government coalition. And I think this is an important thing to understand our systems, and also to understand the populist reactions to our systems. If we look at Trump or Bush being elected also without majority support in the election, I miss in your whole scheme how those systems would be considered. Thank you.
And we'll connect the last question from Andrei.
Thank you very much. I also support this argument. Basically, if somebody said that fair elections, to have fair elections is a key condition, and you are saying that there are no fair elections at all, then we have two options to discuss. One is theoretical, whether this is key condition to have a fair elections, and the second would be empirical condition, whether these unfair elections caused different results, substantially different results. Because we know that the representative of the opposition didn't have more than 5 minutes in the mainstream public service or propaganda media. So I mean, either theoretically, you have to clarify, please, or empirically, if you could prove that the result will be different, there will be no democracy then, or there is no democracy. Thank you.
Listen, let us be fair. Let us be honest here. If you think about the elections in the United States, do you consider them fair? No, they're not. No, they're not fair because of the electoral college, because of the way the elections are, conducted, etc., etc. So this is why I'm using the term relatively fair. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. So I'm using the phrase relatively fair because elections are never fair, very fully fair in no place, because parties in government, parties in office have any reason to influence the electoral outcomes in many ways, and they do have many means of doing that. So I use the case of the United States as my best example of unfair elections. Okay, so the same with Hungary. The elections were unfair, but is Hungary a non-democracy? Let us say that. If we believe that, let us say that and say that Hungary is a non-democracy. I would be fine with that, and then we can have another typology, or you can have your own typology or your own terms. But in my terminology, Hungary is still a democracy, which brings me to your question. There is an impulse towards autocracy in populism. We see that in all cases of populism, and that is another very important thing. I mean, populism as democratic illiberalism, cannot be static for a number of reasons. We don't have the time. But there is not an equilibrium there. So populism as democratic illiberalism will have to either move towards a liberal democratic direction and become liberal democracy again, go to the beginning, to the starting point, or move towards an autocratic, non-democratic direction, which is what happened, for example, in Venezuela, right? In other cases as well. So we might see that in Hungary. So I was very curious actually to see how that election, the last election, would play out. It played out, in a non-surprising way, but we might have seen surprises there, but we didn't. So there is an impulse towards autocracy there, which I always have in mind, and I have talked about that in my work. About the electoral systems, I don't know how to deal with that. I mean, we have electoral systems there. As far as democracy is liberal, I take it as it is with the electoral system that it has. But you should not forget the possibility of referendums. So, for example, in the UK, you have the first past the post electoral system, but you had the referendum that changed everything there. So, in France, if Le Pen became elected, for example, she had said that she would rule by referenda. The same with Mélenchon. So you have possibilities there to bypass the electoral laws, etc., etc. But I do not, consider that in detail, to tell you the truth. So.
Okay, thank you very much. We use all our time. So thank you again, Takis, for your interesting keynote and for the subsequent debate. And just please, we will continue immediately with the first panel about populism and COVID in here, and the second parallel panel, which will be at the same floor just next, in the room next doors. We will be talking about populism and climate in Central Europe. So we are just continuing without a break.